Okay, I make it officially 3 minutes past the hour, so I think we should kick off. As I mentioned, very excited to be able to speak to you today on the new threat of cyber warfare. What we're going to do is we're going to spend the next few minutes with some introductions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the threat environment, give some context and background to our discussions. And we firmly believe as a panel that prevention is always better than cure. So we will spend some time sharing our insights on that topic, just really what can be done to prevent or mitigate. And then, of course, inevitably when the worst happens, how do you manage a breach, an incident? And we'll end the session by spending some time talking about sort of resilience and capacity building, I think all very important in the current context. So to start off with, we'll just introduce ourselves. My name is Deanne HewardMills. I'm the CEO of HewardMills. We are a global data protection office. So we act as DPO for many multinational clients, and then we also support in-house DPOs. So can I perhaps pass on next to Dan Patterfield to introduce yourself, Dan?
Thanks, Dan. And good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so I lead the cybersecurity program at Tech UK, which is the National Trade Association for the digital and technology sectors. In terms of cybersecurity, we've probably got around 250 to 300 members who have got some level of interest in the kind of cyber ecosystem, and that's part of a broader membership of 850 members, ranging from your big tech behemoths, your Facebooks and Googles and Microsofts, right through to the smallest innovators and SMEs. And I suppose we exist to do three broad things, which is grow various markets, including in cybersecurity, ensure that the industry voice is taken on board in policy development, and also supporting wider growth of the ecosystems that we work across. So nurturing things like skills and diversity across key areas. And looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Tom, perhaps you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Egan. I'm head of research at the Disruption House. The Disruption House is a provider of key audit metrics and assessments for companies, which are essentially assessing in the sections of ESG, business assessments and technical assessments, including cyber. And it helps us with insights and research, and allowing them to go through pathways to improve their businesses, and generally take the maturity level of the company through the various stages to improve all of the aspects that they require. That's me in a nutshell, I suppose. So, and I'll pass on to John.
Guys, turn the mute off. I told you guys that always tricks me. John Berry, Pivot Point Security. We're pretty easy to understand. We help orgs that need to be proven secure and compliant prove it. Think things like ISO 27001, SOC 2, FedRAMP, High Trust. Think ensuring that their clouds, networks, and applications are secure through application pen testing and technical assessment. Think ensuring that they've got the right strategy and people through virtual CISO and virtual security teaming type stuff. And I think I was invited just to bring a US perspective. Seems
not only, much more than that, but we're glad to have you on the line. Thank you, John. Finally, Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Egan, no relation to Tom Egan. I've been a cybersecurity consultant for the last 8 years. I started my career in a defense company in the UK, so primarily working with government customers before making the jump to more commercial consulting. And I've had the privilege of the last couple of years of working with Deanne at HewardMills. So stretching my skills a little bit and jumping more into the privacy domain, as well as being the in-house cybersecurity consultant. So it's nice to be on the call, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thank you all. And I think what's great about this panel is that the different perspectives that we're bringing. So great to have industry, representation, great to have individuals who have a wide breadth of experience, different sectors. And all of that is very useful when looking at this issue and discussing this issue. And perhaps we can start just with that mindset of that broader context and the current threat environment. So CISOs like yourself, John, we were just kind of recovering from the impact of COVID and remote working. And then lo and behold, we have this issue of the current situation in Eastern Europe. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, how that has influenced this area and some of the experiences that you have had to deal with given that current threat environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think none of us would argue that the typical company, even an SMB, SME, looks a heck of a lot different today than it did just 5-6 years ago, right? If you go back in time, we just started to really see the rise of the cloud. And that certainly accelerated during the pandemic because work from home introduced, new attack vectors. It introduced a rise in cyber attacks, most notably ransomware. And both of those necessitated really new security architectures, right? Phrases like CASB and SASE came into our lexicon. So, concurrently, as a result of this, right, we're seeing a corresponding rise in both client contractual and regulatory requirements worldwide, both from a privacy perspective and information security perspective. So we're getting guidance on, how we're going to secure IoT devices. You guys have probably seen in the US, and we're starting to see it elsewhere across the world, that the governments are regulating the IoT devices and software, right? Changing the landscape of what we're expected to be able to do as organizations. So I think that's what we're seeing the most. And then really what I think that the conversation typically ends up in, what is the best way for us to get and stay secure and compliant, at this point in time? And that's generally about finding the right, people, process, and technology, ideally to prevent first, if not prevent, detect, and then if not detect in a timely manner, recover from a cyber incident. Because the number of organizations that have been, 37% of organizations and $20 billion last year were lost to ransomware. Just that one attack vector.
Thank you, John. So yes, absolutely. Understanding kind of the impact, the acceleration of risk as well as regulation. Dan, what has been the guidance? What has been the communication with your members, given that sort of the threat, if you like, environment that we're navigating currently?
Yeah, thanks. I think I agree with everything that John's just outlined there, and I think my organisation kind of looks at the broader sector as a whole, if you like. And I think obviously there's two issues around the current threat landscape that we'll talk about in depth today. Obviously, the ongoing war in Ukraine, which really brings into focus how cyber resilience and mitigations have never been so important and significant. And then the wider piece that John's mentioned there about the kind of rapid digital transformation we've seen accelerate, and I think will continue to accelerate throughout, I suppose, the final throes of the pandemic, if you like. And I think what I'd give is a really optimistic assessment as to where the UK sits in regards to both of those. So in December, UK government released its third iteration of a national cyber strategy. And that's all happened over the last decade. And in my view, that's really been vital in establishing and maintaining the UK as a leading cyber nation. But why does that particularly matter? I think both in terms of national prosperity and the national security piece, those two things really complement each other. So it's significant that the UK is able to now boast, I think it's 1,800 cybersecurity firms in the UK, 52,000 full-time cyber employees, about 10 billion in revenue for the Exchequer, and it's also the fastest growing element of UK's defence and security exports. So what we see is that real kind of mature ecosystem growing and growing in the UK, and that plays into the national security piece. It allows organisations that we've established, like the National Cybersecurity Centre, that kind of trusted national technical authority, which is trusted not only by businesses but equally by citizens. It allows them to really lean into industry and rely on that strong public-private partnership to further collaboration and ensure that the kind of most cutting-edge practices or technologies are being used not only to defend kind of national security apparatus, but also clients and companies across the private sector as well.
And that's really important, in terms of actually that infrastructure of support and what's required, what's needed. Caitlin, as a DPO, do you want to give some sort of insight into how that changing landscape impacts what we do?
Sure. I think, we've been increasingly looking at business continuity of our clients, which is something that was sort of always on the back burner because we had, GDPR a few years ago that came into full force. We all worried about the front end, sort of getting the right policies and processes up to speed for our clients. But now we've started to look at that resilience piece in the context of this more complex threat environment. And as John mentioned, we had this massive acceleration in digital transformation for a lot of businesses. And I was just going to bring in the Log4j exploit that we experienced over the last couple of years, which really exposed the importance of sort of vendor and third-party risk management. And it brought that for a lot of businesses again. So it's again just that much more complex sort of resilient and risk piece that has been brought back into the forefront of what we need to focus on with our clients, which is for me actually quite fun to work on as opposed to just policies.
Absolutely, I hear you on that. And Tom, some of your experiences of this sort of changing threat landscape.
I suppose what we're looking at is the expansion of the threat landscape. So technology is pervasive. It's across everything. And the more we integrate technology into our lives, from IoT to personal devices, and people are now putting technology into every aspect of the life that they lead. And every single aspect that you use technology increases the threat. So the threat landscape, the horizon, the event horizon, as some people might call it, is an ever expanding circle. So the struggles of trying to keep up with this from an industry perspective and from a personal perspective are ever expanding. So if you're not taking care of the core of the business that you're in, you don't stand a chance, because you've got to worry about everything. And I'm sure we can move back to the other panelists later about the different styles and types and places, and whether it's data or whether it's entitlements. Just read any book on security and you'll just find that it's across everything. So I think my personal I suppose concept of this is the risk, and the risk becomes the expansion and keeping up with that expansion. So if you're not keeping up with the basics, the things you know about, it's the unknown unknowns that are constantly expanding that you've really got to be aiming for. So if you haven't covered what you know, how are you keeping up with the rest?
And that's a really important point, I think, Tom. And this, as you say, ever expanding, ever sort of, prevalent risk. And I think actually sharing some examples of how things can go badly wrong is always helpful. This, of course, is a very sensitive area, but Tom, you were speaking with us just before the start of the session about your experience of a case that was in the public domain. So perhaps you can share a little bit about that, and then we can talk about some of the preventative steps that can be taken so that organizations don't find themselves in this situation. Sure.
Well, Caitlin just mentioned the Log4j, which is across. I mean, if you take that, that's essentially a set of logging, essentially open source or bought logging mechanisms across every single Java instance. I know friends who run open online marketplaces with 80 members of staff, and they had so much trouble with that one. Just note to Caitlin there. I mean, he was in a nightmare, and that's a global firm. I can't mention it. But the one I can mention, of course, is the recent ransomware attack, which was on the HSE, which is the health executive in Ireland, the equivalent of the NHS in England, but it's a little bit more like the US, where it's a public-private state, but it's essentially our health system. So the health system in Ireland was there very happily working away, and they had a massive ransomware attack from a certain organization. I won't mention them either, but well, it's all very well known and documented. And it took down the whole health system of Ireland. And quite simply, it was typical ransomware attack. As it happens, the Irish government turned around and said, we just can't pay this. And they actually gave the keys back and unlocked the ransomware attack. Even after they gave the keys back, they did it to prove a point or whatever. It still took 4 to 6 months recovery in and around that. You could not buy a laptop in Ireland for about 2 months last year. Between April and June, if you wanted to buy a laptop, you had to buy a high-spec games laptop. They lost all of their emails, like the whole lot. They couldn't even get the backups. They had some of them running on Lotus from back in the day. It was everything. It was a whole lot. And when you actually talk about going back to antiquated systems, because our healthcare system is actually quite antiquated, they were actually able to go back to paper and pen, and that's what it took. So you had doctors running down corridors with pieces of paper to get x-rays. And I know this from a fact because I was volunteering for a charity in the organization at the time and had to do a quick turnaround for a fund of theirs, which was not for profit. And so all the charity not for profit, so nothing that I can't talk about. But the point is, it was actually, this is affecting people getting x-rays, people getting cancer treatment, people getting it really in the middle of a pandemic. It was a very nasty thing to do. And though we cannot talk about our clients in and around the public sector or the private sector, this was a charity, so I can talk about it. It was atrocious. It was atrocious to see. So, I mean, every single part of that organization was affected, and it took months and months and months to get back. It's probably, and there are some bits that won't. To Sligo, and I think it was Waterford hospitals weren't on the new system. So they've just said, we'll just leave all the old emails. Imagine the patient data and the company data that got ripped out of that, and the personal data that got ripped out of that. It's a hacker's absolute dream. And they took down a whole country. So though when we're looking at cyber attacks, we're looking at, critical infrastructure, electricity, oil, etc. A health system is pretty critical for infrastructure. So I'd like to present that to the panel and say, think about that, talk about the health sector as an example, because that's the case study I suppose Diane has brought up. But take your pick. There's quite a lot in it.
And then actually, what you describe is a very common scenario, right? Absolute blind panic, understanding where the special categories in particular of data that may be compromised, and actually the impact, the life and death situation that creates. And ultimately, what steps can organizations take? Often for scale-up organizations, they don't have extensive resource individuals who are experts on cybersecurity, data protection, privacy. We can't all hire the John Verrys of this world, but John, in terms of expertise in this area and sharing some of that knowledge.
But if he wants to volunteer, he can come to Ireland.
Yeah, as
John.
many of you as want to hire me as you can, I'm up for it. I mean, I've got four free hours on Saturday left in my week. I mean, somebody
can get you a few trips to Connemara.
Yeah, I mean, the CISO really steps into their own in these scenarios, and I just want for you to share some of that kind of knowledge, best practice, insights in terms of prevention.
Yeah, yeah. So unfortunately, I would say I don't have good news, right? Because your adversary is dangerous, right? And they're going to climb over the lowest fence. So what you really need to do is have a comprehensive program. I mean, there's no really way around it these days. With 37% of the organizations last year being compromised, those are the ones that reported it. The number's probably higher than that because most people hide it. It doesn't, and by the way, it does not matter. Most organizations that I talk to are like, oh, we're too small, nobody's interested in us. You have to understand that attacks are either opportunistic or they're intentioned. Now, so you're right, you're probably too small to have an intentioned attack, but an opportunistic attack, they're running random scanners across the internet, they're sending random emails, and you might get caught in their web. So please do not think because you're small that you're not a target. I think fundamentally it's pretty simple, much the same way that if you ask me how to stay healthy, I would tell you to, eat well and exercise, but very few of us do it. It's the same thing with information security. There's a fundamental, it doesn't matter if you're ISO 27001, doesnn matter if you follow SOC 2, high trust, FedRAMP, CMMC, NIST 80171, all of the good frameworks largely say the same thing. Understand what kind of information you process. Understand the context around it, the people, processes, systems, understand the laws and regulations that govern its operation, understand client contractual obligations if you service third parties, because if you can't service your clients, you can't do anything. Once we understand that, understand the risk to that data, then my recommendation is always to pick a trusted framework to align your organization with. I don't care if it's ISO 27001, ISO 27002, the Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. Pick a good framework. Why? Frameworks educate your people. Frameworks make products interoperate. Frameworks make sure it's sort of like a checklist manifesto, right? The likelihood of you missing something goes down inordinately. And then prioritize, working your way through that. Ensure that as you get to implementing these controls, you're going to need what we call a trusted ecosystem. That's the right people and the right product. Right. And the idea behind that is to operationalize that in such a way that it generates a reliable source of what we call trusted information. Right. You as the owner of the organization, you as the CISO, you need to have information that's being generated by these processes that they're actually occurring. Right. And that they're actually effective at what they're doing. And of course, the only constant in life is change. Right. So you're going to have to, once we kind of follow that wheel around, it's time to start over. What has changed? What new laws and regulations are out there? What new customer client contractual obligations have come in? What new regulations have evolved, right? Because security is really not a destination. It's a journey.
Thank you. All very useful guidance there, John. And Dan, if I can turn to you in terms of preventative messaging to individuals and businesses, what is Tech UK's stance and how best to prevent these sorts of incidents from decimating an organization?
Yeah, I think I'd agree that, we see many, obviously a lot of the kind of most high profile breaches have happened in the supply chain more recently. And I think, I'd agree with John that criticality is not linked to scale in that way. So all organizations or even individuals should be looking at all the kind of key elements and seeing what the risk profile or threat is to their organization and how a breach for them might affect others as well. I think I see it in a kind of golden triangle of people, process and technology. And in my experience, usually organizations will focus on one or two, but most haven't cracked all three. And I think the one that I'd pick out there is that without the people element, you're kind of nowhere, because you've got to have people that understand the process, but also can understand the technology and what it's doing for an organization. And that's really difficult to do in this space, specifically for smaller businesses. And a kind of key point I'd make there is that I think we often conflate two things when we talk about cyber skills. Certainly in the UK, we kind of talk about this broader cyber skill shortfall, but actually what we're talking about there is two separate challenges. There's the kind of cyber hygiene that everybody needs in all roles. And that's, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's a deeply technical role or it's a kind of customer facing role, everyone needs to get some level of good cyber hygiene to, avoid those kind of attacks that we see every day come into his email inboxes. But then there's also the broader cyber skills challenge, which is for the technical roles, people that require real cybersecurity qualifications and training to do a specific task or role profile within an organization. And I think that's something that we need to get our heads around a bit more in the UK. And it's great to see government support the UK Cybersecurity Council to kind of further that journey, if you like. But I think that for me, that it's usually the people element that I think unlocks the other two.
And I couldn't agree more. I think that's sort of understanding people and particular roles and responsibilities. And I hear what you say about the need to educate the kind of talent coming through. I was very impressed by the statistics that you gave in terms of like 52,000 cybersecurity employees in the UK, and boy, are they needed. I wonder, Caitlin, though, if we can say something about the people at the top and accountability and some of the work that needs to be done at the sort of board level, because we find that is absolutely key in terms of getting the investment and the effort, the resources required within organizations.
Sure. I mean, I can only speak to my experience, but a common thing that I see is obviously accountability is often there, but only at a bare minimum. And what we really, really want, especially as a DPO, is actually engagement from the board. And not just seeing cyber risk and privacy risk as sort of a checkbox exercise. We want them to actually, be open to even attending sessions where we can discuss the real risks to their business, get them involved in even tabletop exercises so they can really, really understand how prepared their business is. I mean, recently we've been running some tabletops where we've been, running through the business continuity plans for businesses that felt they were well prepared. And then when they were presented with a challenging incident, they realized just how much was lacking, how there was a lot in their plan that was not practical, out of date. Communication and escalation guidelines were not lined up to severity grades for incidents. So, there was some really helpful results that came out of that exercise, but to equally have boards engaged on that and understanding where the business is and where it needs to be just adds that level of buy-in that is essential and allows people like us, consultants and DPO services, to really, really do their job.
Absolutely. And actually, the more sort of forward planning, the better. And it's often said it's not a question of if, it's when. And so when the inevitable does happen and that clock starts to tick, and you are at the point of realizing that this is a situation that crosses that harm threshold. So we're in a situation much in the way that Tom described, where there's health data, there's potentially, life-threatening scenarios. In the throes of all of that, what do you do, John? How do you guide an organization through navigating this? And let's assume that this is an incident that impacts globally. So you've got potential reporting obligations in the US, you've got reporting obligations across Europe, reporting obligations in APAC. How do you navigate this? What happens in that scenario?
So, you actually need to start in the proactive state, where if you get to an incident and you don't already have an incident response plan, if you haven't put those mechanisms in place prior, you are up a creek without a proverbial paddle, right? So first and foremost, right, you need to have an incident response plan. You need to understand who you're going to call, when you're going to call them, who's going to do what before this even starts. But once it does start, one of the things I see where there's significant challenges is people don't understand what their requirements are. So to your point, right, you need to have a clear understanding of what are your regulatory requirements, what are your contractual obligations if you're working for third parties, right? Because you've committed in contracts to notify them on breach, right? So breach notification, in both of those cases is going to be important. And then the last thing that people screw up on a lot is they have to understand that if they're maintaining cyber liability insurance, that cyber liability insurance, you need to understand what the obligations that you're encumbered with through the cyber liability insurance. Most cyber liability insurance policies have what's referred as authorized response agents or something similar. You're going to get a legal breach counselor usually assigned to a case. Where I've seen clients have significant problems is where they've gone too far down the rabbit hole of trying to troubleshoot and fix something before they've engaged. And what's happened is it's obviated the coverage, right? So they've been paying for cyber liability insurance for 3 years. They have a breach. They did too much. They didn't follow good forensic practices. And what they ended up was losing their coverage based on that. So I think those are the most important things. And one thing, I know I spoke at a 10,000 foot level about things to do. If you were only going to do one thing right now, from a ransomware perspective, is to make sure that you've got non-persistently connected backups somewhere. right? They're not on your network. They're not persistent cloud connections. And then perhaps even more importantly, the bad guys have gotten very smart. So when they compromise an environment, they don't immediately start a ransomware attack. What they're now doing is using the administrative privilege that they gain to actually disable the backups if you're not paying attention, or if you're not testing those backups, so they'll alter the backups in such a way that you think you're covered. And then what happens is then they attack, and 30 days worth of data is gone. And now you do have to pay the ransom. So those would be my thoughts there.
Thank you, John. That's a lot to navigate. I wonder, any other panelists have some sort of insights to share to follow up from John's very, very helpful guidance?
I think the aspect of training as well is important to remind ourselves about, because if you're not training your staff to know that these issues exist, they won't have this in their head, and you're going to have to, you're going to be wanting to it can't be one person making this decision. It's got to be across the organization. So it's important to do consistent training, and then obviously from a management perspective, you have to use cybersecurity experts. You have to use the right people to train don't assume that people have this knowledge. I think that's just a reminder, really.
And I think that's a good point. I mean, you might have some skill sets, knowledge internally within the organization, but you've got to think broadly as to actually who are you going to, need in that scenario? What additional specialist support might you require? Whether it's, as John mentioned, sort of forensic support, it may be support of legal counsel, support of a communications team, additional support to deal with inquiries coming in from your customers, from your employees, and actually without running these scenarios, as Caitlin mentioned, the tabletop scenarios, those are the sorts of opportunities to flesh out the external support. How do you coordinate?
Sorry to cut across you, Dan, but to have a security mindset in each of your departments. So the people who are running your compliance department should have a security mindset. The people who are running your BCPs, your war games, all of that. It shouldn't just be the responsibility of, you'll bring in the specialists, but it's not their responsibility to solve your problem. It's the firm's responsibility to have a security aware environment and to have it embedded within it. You bring in the specialists, you bring in the people, you have to pay them money to do that. But once it's there, it's your responsibility to keep that maintained. And each of the different departments within your organization have to then take that and have a security mindset within their department, as well as then taking, and of course you have to have that at the board level, as mentioned earlier. It's just a reminder. Sorry to cut across you.
No, that's a very valid point. And it's about the sort of accountability and responsibility and that ongoing obligation. It's the organization that has that responsibility on it. Dan, any more to add to this conversation at this
Yeah,
point?
I think I'd completely agree with that last point. And I think there's kind of two broader points that I'd add, I suppose, and they are, I suppose, broad kind of cross-sector things. I think as a sector, we need to be a bit louder about how we're talking about what we do. And that's not, as we said before, cyber's not the kind of fiefdom of the IT department or the responsibility of one specific person or individual or team within an organization. It's everybody's shared responsibility. And as a sector, we enable increasingly everything that an organization does. So we should talk about ourselves in that way, rather than kind of just a risk to be managed, if you like. I think that the second point, picking up on what Caitlin was talking about in terms of board engagement, I think the key there is, and I'm talking mainly about large organizations now, is what the CISO function is doing within an organization. And we did some work last year and it looked at how that role's really evolving over time, and moving increasingly away from the technical to that kind of communications piece, engaging with everyone within an organization at their level, at a level that they can understand and engage with. When you're talking to a board, it's obviously more focused on bottom line and risk. When you're talking to a kind of customer facing person who's got less of a role, I suppose, talk about it in a way that makes sense to them. How can they translate that into the personal lives? We see these risks all the time. So I think that's a kind of a key point, what the people who are ultimately responsible for cyber within an organization are doing should be tailored towards that, if that makes sense.
Deanne, I was wondering if I could ask a question to my fellow panelists as people with many years of experience. Have you seen an example of an organization that has a really, really rigorous and successful training program? Because in my experience, you either have the sort of like LMS approach where you have the front loading and that's renewed annually. There's not a lot of the sort of like interim and knowledge update and knowledge sharing, or you have those sort of like ad hoc training sessions that's all done, verbally by someone who's brought in, once a quarter or once a year. Is there sort of a method that you've seen that you think is really, really successful in an organization?
I've seen way more that are unsuccessful. I think when you look at training, there's two problems that I think with the training. First off, I think too much training focuses on security awareness education. Not that security education isn't important, but the reality is we run phishing programs. We've never gotten an organization down between 2 and 4%, people clicking on bad emails that could compromise them. So we're done with training. I mean, the training is helpful, yeah, but you really need to build a process such that even if someone clicks on that link, because you have to assume they're going to, you're not going to get compromised. So that part of the training is what most people do, and I think it's not well effective at all. I think the second thing is that people should be training people on the important components of their information security program. One of the nice things about ISO 27001 is, in theory, it requires that, although the auditors don't hold your feet to the fire as much as they should. But what we try to do is, and we see the most success is where somebody actually has custom crafted training that explains to people what type of data is in their environment, what the laws and regulations are, what the expectations are for how to treat that, and what are the critical expectations in terms of, as Tom was talking about, recognizing an incident and reporting it, understanding authentication, authorization requirements, all that kind of fun stuff. So that would be where I see the best programs, but I don't see enough of them.
I think I'd probably kind of echo a lot of that. I think people don't want to do training for a start. I think, people are busy enough already. I think as Tech UK, we represent a number of kind of cyber vendors that offer cyber awareness training or different levels of training. So I won't pick out any individual, but I think the ones that I've seen be most successful are the ones that are modular. People can access them in their own time, but are forced to access them. And secondly, those ones that are a bit more tailored to the business as a whole and gamified, if you like. I think that's the kind of clear trend.
And also sharing experiences, sharing knowledge, and of small incidents, which may point to some other sort of systemic risk. And what we find is most successful is when there is that cross organization. So not operating in down. The CISO within an organization is communicating to different functions within the business at a level that they can understand. And actually, Caitlin, do you want to some time just talking a little bit more about that, means of security, data protection, compliance, legal, how together?
Apologies, Deanne. I don't know if it's just on my end, but you were very choppy then. So I actually didn't catch any of that. So I don't know what I'm meant to be talking to. Was that the same for everyone else? Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't hear it.
Okay.
Oh, internet is dropping slightly.
But we were talking about knowledge sharing in general.
Did you catch that?
I didn't fully. But if we're talking about
Caitlin, time to tap dance. Come on, let's go. Let's see it. Let's break out the tap dancing shoes.
I know.
Say something intelligent. It doesn't matter what it is. Just say something intelligent.
I was just going to say that having industry bodies that share learnings can be very, very useful. I mean, I was looking at some of the statistics, as you do before a cyber webinar, and it was interesting to me to look at some of the sectors that were most hit the last couple of years, and education and research consistently tops that, and healthcare is also always in the top 3. And I, again, I put out to my fellow panelists, what do you think that is? Aside from sometimes lack of preparedness, do you think it's a lack of sharing industry knowledge, sharing threats, sharing learnings from incidents? Or do you just think it's poor resourcing, poor processes, poor preparedness?
I'm happy to take that one first. I think I think you've got to, knowledge sharing is always going to be difficult. And I think broadly in cyber, the threats that we all face are the same. So they apply across different sectors. And there's always going to be a breach that you can learn from. And usually we're relatively bad at doing that. I think there's some really good examples where we might be seeing that change and people kind of understanding that, breaches are going to happen. Let's talk about them, get to the bottom of them and honestly discuss what we can do better next time. I don't think they'd mind me mentioning them, but obviously SolarWinds had a big hack a couple of years ago now, and they came out and spoke about it with us and NCSC in a kind of public forum and talked about what lessons they'd learned from that. I think that's really powerful and kind of people can take a lot from that, and we should see that more because everyone's having these breaches. It's not just one particular company. So what learnings can we all take? I think in terms of the kind of key sectors that we see maybe struggling a little bit more or having more attacks and breaches, I think we obviously had the NIS directive come in CNI and for the kind of digital service providers a few years ago. We've just finished a consultation with DCMS on how that might broaden out in future. I think that probably there's learnings from there in terms of how we're assessing cyber risk and using things like the cyber assessment framework more effectively, that we can translate to other areas. I know government plan to do that through their government cybersecurity strategy. So, things like that, let's use what we've already got instead of trying to boil the ocean in every specific sector, I think.
Yeah, in the US, we have all of our critical infrastructure. We have what's called ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And I find what the problem is two things. One, it's a bandwidth issue, and it's also a data quality issue. On the bandwidth side, most people don't have enough time. Most security departments are already understaffed. They really don't have the time to kind of pay attention to all that and say, what does this mean to me? Right? Properly contextualize it. It's also complicated by the fact that the data quality is not very good. So what I mean by that is the data hasn't been normalized and it hasn't been looked at. So someone can report the same thing in 3 different ways. So because of the noise in the data, it makes even using the data that much harder. So I think if we gave people more time and we made the data higher quality, we'd have a lot better success.
Hopefully my internet is now back on and you can hear me okay. I think what we wanted to try and do is to use the last 10 minutes of the session for Q&A. So we're coming up to that. We've got 5 more minutes before then. So the panelists will continue to discuss this, but if anyone has any questions at all that they want to ask, if you just drop those questions in the chat and we will seek to respond to those. But otherwise, what I wanted to draw upon is this interaction between CISO, the privacy office, legal teams, compliance teams, and risk. How can we ensure that we are more joined up, or are we just destined to work in silos because we speak completely different languages?
From my perspective, we're being, as an I'm an information security guy, in my opinion, not a privacy guy. And we're being dragged into privacy. I don't think there's a choice, right? We're seeing a consolidation of these two. So, and I think it needs to be done because, you can't have privacy without security. So we need to understand what our obligations are. So I think we have to find a way to work together. One of the nice things about this, and I think one of the things that's helping people that are information security practitioners move towards privacy is a really nice framework called ISO 27701. So if you're 27001 certified, you can also get a certification in privacy. What it does is you extend your information security management system such that it becomes an information security and privacy management system. And what that allows you to do is run your privacy program and your information security program under one logical construct. And I think that really endorses and enforces that necessary integration that has to happen for us to be successful. One other reason I think it's really important is because the privacy space tends to be dominated more by people who have legal background, and information security is increasingly becoming a legal place, right? So you got to understand and interpret the laws and regulations. Your cyber liability insurance policy is a legal contract, right? So what happens is too many information security practitioners sign off on client contracts and cyber liability contracts without understanding the legal obligation. So I think information security gets better when privacy people with a legal background get involved. And I think privacy gets better when information security people that are responsible for ensuring all the controls are implemented properly get involved. So I think the mesh is happening, and I think it's really something that we need to have happen.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And in terms of proactivity, they certainly come together in the throes of a breach, right? Because if you're going through this, you're going to have your legal people, you're going to have your security people, you're going to have your data protection, privacy experts around the table. So what we're saying, John, and what we're advocating for, and I know you and I are absolutely on the same page on this, is that let's come together before. Let's come together. Let's strategize. Let's gain those certifications, those standards beforehand, because actually that puts us in a much stronger position and makes us much more resilient in the face of a breach and an attack. From
your lips to God's ears.
Indeed. Anyone else have any comments on that? Caitlin?
I would just, sharing some experience, and generally I agree. I mean, I found in the past when I'm on secondment from the DPO that I'm the one who ends up being the interface between privacy and security teams in-house. And, my experience from that is just that I got to the point where I'm like, we really need proper engagement and proper channels of communication, because once I'm gone, what are you guys going to do? So now we've started to try and do that with our customers at the DPO, but so often we start the conversation where the information security team is completely left out of the picture, and we're sort of pushing our clients to engage them, and they're like, oh, we don't want to bother them, they're very overstretched, they've got a lot going on, they're managing their own frameworks, and we're constantly looking for that sort of middle ground. So it's really, optimistic to hear from people like John in here that they're finding the same things and that they see a future for us integrating, consolidating, and working together.
I think the integration, I think you're right, Caitlin. I think the integration needs to happen. Intellectual property doesn't disappear when somebody steals your software. You still own the intellectual property, right? But you just don't have the code that was embedded to create it. So somebody can steal your software. They haven't stolen the intellectual property because the intellectual property still resides in the company. Very simple example. But unless we have the meshing of these particular concepts and departments, then it's not as useful. All you have is people worrying about something that somebody can answer quickly. So we should be all here to help each other. We're all on the same side, I hope.
Absolutely. And I have a question coming in. And the question is this: in line with the increased risk, where should a business start when reassessing its approach to cyber security? Where do you start?
So if it's a small business, I mean, it always starts with its context and risk. It has to start there, because if you don't understand what you have, right? And then if you're a small business and you haven't done this before, I would start with the simplest framework that you can. Take a look at the Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls Implementation Group. I think they're now calling it ONE, right? Which is, hey, these are the most essential. What it does is it gives you a scale to prioritize which information security controls are the most important, and then build up. You guys are, I hate to say this as a US person, but I mean, the UK leads the world in information security. I mean, you guys, ISO 17799 through 27002, 27001. I'm a huge advocate of what you guys propose, right? 27001 is my favorite, but it is encompassing. And I think the CIS, critical security controls, are in a very simplified approach for most organizations to start with.
Yeah, we also have Cyber Essentials, don't we, which is a more manageable standard for smaller organizations. Also, Dan or Caitlin, any more to add to that?
I think kind of agree on all the standards and framework points. I think from a commercial perspective, I always find that, always feel sorry for those companies starting out on this journey, because it's a incredibly busy marketing space, right? And we all get the emails every day from hundreds of different people, and obviously there's vendors out there selling things like silver bullets which don't exist and all these kind of things. So I think that's the key thing, is finding some really trusted partners, and there's various routes that you can do that. Obviously, people involved in things like trade associations like Tech UK don't tend to be those kind of snake oil salesmen, and there's various other routes, even kind of through official channels and that kind of thing. You can find people who will give you some good advice to get you started, because it's really difficult for someone who doesn't talk cyber every day, because it's not something you can get your hands on and road test, is it? It's something that you've got to trust in, and kind of you can't getting that further assurance is really difficult, and something the sector as a whole needs to get a bit better at, kind of showing that assurance, I suppose.
I have a question for you guys. So would you agree that if somebody was really needed to be simpler than that, if they said, what's the first thing that I should do, especially with so many people using Office 365, Microsoft 365, I would say multi-factor authentication for all authentication. If you're only going to do one thing today, might be the first best thing you can do. Yeah. What do you guys think?
I 100% agree with that, having just had a cousin who's just been compromised precisely because they didn't have MFA. So 100% on the page.
Yeah, that's really good advice. We've got another question coming in. So cybersecurity has certifications like this, Cyber Essentials, PCI. Do you think it's time for GDPR stroke data protection recognized certification? So John, you've already mentioned ISO 27701. Any other frameworks that are purely sort of GDPR data protection focused, or should there be?
I think it's potentially a little early, because the privacy landscape is evolving so quickly. I mean, we've got PIPL, we've got the movements in the US, so potentially a little early for an official recognized standard. And also, I think a lot of organizations are currently not in a good place to be shooting for a privacy standard. They need to really view it as more of an evolving program. And just get the basics in place. But I'm open to other opinions. And Deanne, I mean, you're the leader on the panel on this.
Yeah, I mean, there is binding corporate rules, which is the European, high standard, where you go to a supervisory authority with your program and you identify your lead authority who would then explore that and investigate it, and potentially certify you as being, BCR standard, which is, very, very high standard. It really helps to with the transfer of data, which is obviously very topical at the moment, outside of jurisdiction. But in order to get that BCR, you also have to demonstrate that you've got, good audit in place, a good compliance program, you're doing your training, and actually to go to a regulator with that confidence to say, look, explore this program and give me this standard it's a way of getting to that high standard as an organization. And we certainly have a number of clients who we're supporting around BCR, but it's not a place to start, for sure. And I should mention also that the UK supervisory authority has designed its own BCR, because the UK has fallen outside of Europe post-Brexit. So you can get a European BCR standard, you can get a UK BCR standard, but that's again, very, very high standard. I think ultimately it's not just about the certifications, it's about what you're the work that you're doing internally. So, I mean, do you really, as has been said, have a good understanding of what data you have, where it flows to, who has access to it? And so satisfying basic requirements like having a good, robust record of processing activity, just start there, it really will help significantly, and potentially is a good basis to start to attain some of those other standards. So that would be my response and advice on that question. Okay, so we've got just a couple of minutes left. Final parting words from the panelist. Maybe start with you, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's been a great discussion. I think to kind of John's final question there, what would you first do today if you were starting from scratch? I suppose my kind of starting point would be the guidance that NCSE produces. We've kind of gone to great lengths to develop this, world leading institution. So let's listen to what it's saying about various things.
Thank you. Tom?
I'd say understand and assess. Assess have and what you think you have, and then because you can dive in at the deep end and not understand what you're doing.
Great. Caitlin?
I'd say communication, which I think has been a big theme on this call, but particularly between the privacy security interface and then, from a top to bottom perspective as well throughout the organization, communicating clearly your posture, what the company's doing, and engaging the board and employees on what they should be doing.
Great. So it's sort of follow the advice of the experts. The National Cybersecurity Centre has great resources. I completely agree with that. Very, very good advice around sort of communication and knowing the basics as well, knowing what you're dealing with as an organization. The one thing I would add to that is just understanding the global landscape as well for many organizations. They want to operate globally, they want to offer their services globally, and so it's continuously evolving. And having that broad understanding is always very, very helpful. So I think that's, a really good discussion. We could have talked on so much ground to cover, but I think that was really useful, packed with some good tips and insights there over the course of the hour. So I hope everyone's enjoyed it. And we look forward to further discussions on this topic. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.